Today we're going to wrap up our series for July that we've been doing based on the theme of freedom. Today we're going to talk about the nature of humankind, and we're going to do that from a unity perspective because I think it's one of our best ideas. Our positive view of humankind and our human potential going into the future. I didn't grow up with a very positive view of human nature. And that's because I attended Catholic schools for most of my formative years, and they gave us the message of original sin. Human beings, so the theory goes, human beings were flawed, fallen, sinful from the moment of birth. And that's not just the Catholic Church that said those kind of things. After the Protestant Reformation, there were people like Luther and Calvin who doubled down on that idea, saying things like, well, humans are utterly depraved, or that here's a good one, we're slaves to sin. Anyone ever hear that if you were from another tradition? We're slaves to sin. Just the opposite of freedom. The polar opposite of freedom. Now lately, they've pulled back a little bit on all the gloom and doom, but when you look carefully, they're still selling us some version of the idea that we're miserable sinners. And I think that is a terrible message. A terrible message to give to a child. Might even be a form of emotional abuse. At its most basic level, when you think about it, the concept of original sin is a way to control and manipulate us. Imagine this. It's like they're telling you that you have accidentally, through no fault of your own, you've ingested this fatal poison. You're actually born with this fatal poison in your system, but fortunately, they just happen to have the antidote over here, and it's available to you for a price, a low, low price, lifetime payments. Do what I say, and I'll give you the antidote. Pledge your loyalty, say the right words, do the right rituals, and you get to live. But if you don't take advantage of this generous one-time offer, maybe somewhere 70 to 90 years in the future, you'll die. And you stop for a moment, you scratch your head, and you think, well, isn't that supposed to happen anyway? And of course, the ones selling this antidote, they have an easy answer to that astute observation. They tell you, well, sure, you're going to die, but with this wonderful antidote that we're about to give you, you get to live again in another place that nobody can see. That's a scam. It's worked very well for centuries, but these days more and more people are standing up, waking up, and saying, we're not buying what you're selling. And they find that they're perfectly capable of being kind, compassionate, and loving human beings with a perfectly normal lifespan without having to drink the Kool-Aid. I meant antidote, but how do they do it? How can they possibly be kind, loving, and compassionate human beings without the antidote being peddled by big religion? Well, it's no secret. It's all a matter of discovering the truth of our being, which is something that a very popular Unity author talks about in a very well-known Unity book. Eric Butterworth wrote this book called Discover the Power Within You. Chapter 3 is called The Great Decision, and Eric uses the teachings of Jesus to show us the power within. But we have to be willing to look at Jesus from a different perspective than we might be used to. Eric is very clear in saying that Jesus did not come to found a new religion. And I know a lot of people who would disagree, but Eric argues that the core of what Jesus taught was what Eric calls the divinity of man, or as I prefer to state it, the dignity of humankind. the essential, innate dignity of humankind. Jesus never talked about original sin. Never mentions it or anything even remotely like it. Original sin was entirely a creation of the early church. It was invented by Augustine in the 4th century based on a very literal interpretation of the Adam and Eve stories in Genesis. Jesus had a much, much more positive vision of human nature. He was inviting people to participate in what he called the kingdom of heaven. You might have heard that terminology if you read the Gospels. When Jesus talked about the kingdom of heaven, he was describing the way the world would be when everyone learned how to live in a different way according to a different set of values, a different worldview. This kingdom wasn't a physical place, it was a state of consciousness. One that's based on a set of shared values that people could practice without the need for a middleman, without the need for an antidote or anything like that. That's why you hear Jesus saying things like this, not just in this passage, but many times, but this is a good example of the kind of thing he would say. He would start out by saying, "You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I say to you," in other words, you've been taught to think this way, but I say to you, try something different. He says, "Love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers and sisters, what more are you doing than others?" Now notice, there's no preconditions here. He doesn't say that you first have to go to the temple and engage in some kind of a special ritual, or attend a weekend workshop where you get a certificate of completion in chakra balancing or loving your enemies or whatever it happens to be. He's not selling a self-help book. He says, just do it. Just do it. The Nike approach. He just assumes that everyone already knows how to do this and is capable of making it happen. So the only thing standing in our way, according to this passage, is our prior conditioning. He says, you have heard that it was said. What he's saying is that you've been given a bunch of secondhand information that you've never questioned. You've been told to love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Well, why don't you just take a few moments to look around and tell me how that's been working for you? The Romans, still here. The tax collectors are still squeezing you dry. And the only ones who seem to be getting ahead in the world are the priests, the scribes, and their cronies. Things can change. Things can change, but only if you change the way you think about yourselves and others. And that doesn't happen overnight. It takes time. This vision of a form of heaven on earth, and that's really what he's getting at here. It's a form of heaven on earth. It's something that has to be introduced gradually. And then it has to be allowed to grow, which is why the Gospels tell about Jesus comparing the kingdom of heaven to things like seeds and yeast. A couple of comparisons he makes here. He says the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that someone took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all the seeds, but when it is grown, it is the greatest of shrubs and becomes a tree. Or the kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed in with 3 measures of flour until all of it was leavened. And of course, you know what happens after you add yeast to flour. It expands and it grows. That's the thing that mustard seeds and yeast have in common. They start out small and they grow into something greater. So, the analogy here is that ideas start out small in consciousness. And then they have to grow, or rather, we have to grow in consciousness. The message is time to leave the shallow end of the pool. Time to leave the acorn stage and become an oak tree. That's another part of our positive vision for humankind and human potential. Don't be afraid to evolve. That's another word for this kind of growth that we're talking about. Evolution. It's our friend. It's a journey, like that Spirit's journey we were singing about earlier today. It's a journey that leads to a good place. Now in Unity, when we talk about Jesus like this, we're looking beyond the human person named Jesus to really focus on what it was that he stood for. What were his core values? In Unity, Jesus symbolizes the essential dignity of every human being. He had evolved to the place in consciousness where we can all get. He was showing us that we can all get here. He had evolved in consciousness to the point where he could demonstrate the way that we need to think and act if we want to bring about the condition or the state of consciousness that he called the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God. Uses a number of different terms for it. We say that Jesus was acting from what we call his Christ nature, which is a word we use to describe the true nature of humankind by right of consciousness. It's innate. Think of it this way. If you were living in a Buddhist culture, over there they call it Buddha nature, our inherent capacity for compassion and deep, deep self-awareness. Jesus made it very clear that the kingdom of God is an intangible realm of lived values. It's not an earthly political system. He made it clear that it was not something that was separate or apart from us. Couldn't be more clear than this passage in Luke where he's talking to the religious authorities and he says, "Now when he was asked by the Pharisees when the kingdom of God would come, he answered them and said, 'The kingdom of God does not come with observation, nor will they say, see here or see there, for indeed the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God is within you.'" Some translations say among you. Same thing. Now you might see that little phrase, kingdom of God or kingdom of heaven, and you might be thinking to yourself, well, that sounds kind of archaic, maybe even a little bit religious. And you know what? You're right. You're right. Kingdoms, monarchies, they're things of the past. This is being written in the language of the past. And it's okay to see that, and it's okay to reframe it. God as some sort of king or ruler is indeed archaic. All that does is sets up more separation. So we can reframe that in any way that we work with ourselves. God as principle, God as the fundamental rules or laws of nature, whatever works for you. The good news, and another part of our positive message, is that we get to guide and speed up that process of evolution. Again, it's another gift that we have by right of consciousness, by right of this human consciousness that we're born with. Sometimes we think of evolution as being something that's very, very slow, which is true of physical evolution, but in terms of the evolution of consciousness, in terms of how we think and regard other beings, we can guide and speed up that evolution. And if we're looking for some evidence that that's been happening, this is a book that I would recommend. It's called The Evolution of God by Robert Wright. He surveys over 3,000 years of human evolution. And he reaches the conclusion that history is trending toward greater health, prosperity, and cooperation on planet Earth. He calls this a non-zero-sum game. I'll explain what that's all about here. Everybody knows what a zero-sum game is, right? A zero-sum game is when, in order for me to win, someone else has to lose. It's the way sports works, right? In the Super Bowl, one team wins, in order for one team to win, the other team has to lose. That's the way sports work. That's the way our political system works. Sometimes. Actually, Abraham Lincoln demonstrated that politics didn't have to be a zero-sum game, because he invited his opponents and his critics after he was elected to be part of his cabinet, to be his advisors. They wrote a whole book about it called A Team of Rivals. So it doesn't have to be. Abraham Lincoln knew how to play a non-zero-sum game where both sides can win, but they have to cooperate. So non-zero sum is win-win instead of win-lose. And it looks like this sometimes. For those of you listening, instead of seeing this visually, what we have here is a big dog with a small dog standing on top of it, with a cat standing on top of the small dog, reaching to the top shelf of an open refrigerator, taking down a six-pack of something that has the words beer written across it. A win-win game, and of course we know that that beer is for their loving master, of course, because as everyone knows, dogs and cats don't like beer. They prefer a dry martini, right? All right, that is a win-win game. Everybody comes out a winner instead of win-lose. Robert Wright makes a very convincing argument that human beings have been evolving toward a non-zero-sum reality, a win-win reality. The kingdom of heaven is a non-zero-sum reality. It's the golden rule in action, and we can consciously direct the process. In fact, we've been doing it, and it's up to us to keep choosing that reality. We're free to choose that reality or something else. But we can make it happen because we're not miserable sinners who need to be rescued. We're not powerless. At the end of his survey in that book, his survey of 3,000 years of human history, Robert Wright reaches this conclusion. Here's what he tells us. History, even if its basic direction is set, can proceed at massive, wrenching human cost. Or it can proceed more smoothly, with costs to be sure, but with more tolerable costs. It is the destiny of our species. And this time I mean the inescapable destiny, not just the high likelihood, to choose. Our inescapable destiny is to make that choice. That's another way of saying that responsibility and freedom go together. So how are we going to use that freedom? How are we going to use our basic human dignity? I think the choice is pretty clear. Choose love. Choose the win-win solution. Choose that which is true, good, and beautiful, and nobody ever has to lose. That's the kingdom of heaven. See you next week.